So I've decided to. Now, what I brought up here actually is obviously a map of Operation Barbarossa. This is up until the launch of Operation Typhoon. So Operation Typhoon was the attempt to take Moscow. Operation Barbarossa was the invasion of Russia proper in 1941. Now, there's a lot of background on why this happened. Obviously, the view of Hitler and the Nazi Party was very anti-communist and anti-Slav, so they did regard the Slavic peoples as inherently inferior, and this colored their treatment of them in places like Poland. So Poland was probably the most preyed upon country in the Second World War in terms of civilian deaths. But basically, the background to this, of course, goes all the way back to the 30s. The Nazis spent a lot of time fighting the communists. They were anti-communists. They spent a lot of time fighting the communists for power. Of course, in terms of the extremists in Germany, you had the Nazis and you had the communists battling it out in the streets. So, of course, the Reichstag fire enabled him to launch the Enabling Act and just suppress his enemies, and he put all the communists in camps, basically, concentration camps. Some of them died there. Some of them were formed in some way. But basically, it was a suppression of communism in Germany. The antipathy toward the communists was pretty widespread in Europe because of the Russian Trotskyite expansionist policy followed by Lenin. Basically, directly after the Russian Civil War, there were attempts by the Bolsheviks to expand, namely into Poland, by means of conventional military. Of course, the Poles, who made a habit of doing this, apparently cracked the codes of the Russians, were able to envelop, outflank their invading army that was outside of Warsaw and basically destroy them. The November revolutions in Germany were mainly communist. The cost of the British blockade to the Germans in the First World War was so vast that there was starvation in the streets. So people were very desperate. There was already a socialist strain in German politics because, of course, if you look at the revolutions of 1848, we know that the Social Democrats in Europe derived their political fortunes from the choice to become involved in parliamentary politics. And in the case of the Germans, the German state, under Bismarck, there were a lot of concessions to the working class. Now, Germany itself obviously became Nazi in 1933. He never won a majority, but he was appointed in power by Hindenburg. And what you have in the 30s, of course, is a series of expansionist policies. They swallow Austria, and they begin to interfere in Czechoslovakia, and the Russians kind of don't know what to do. They're kind of on the fence. There's a non-aggression treaty with Poland, which initially the Germans wanted the Poles as an ally against the Russians, which would have seen a very different war in that case. What ends up happening is that the Poles get a war guarantee from the British, and that really serves as their background. Of course, Poland was not a democracy. It was a military dictatorship at this time. And the Germans insist on getting rid of the Polish corridor between their border and Danzig and or their border in East Prussia. And that pretty much begins the war. Of course, prior to this, there was a Nazi-Soviet pact, which had been announced, which enabled a lot of economic cooperation between the two powers. In fact, the Russian staples, including oil, were pretty vast. We know that Russian oil was very key to enabling the German military to do things like fight the Battle of Britain, and that stuff didn't come out until recently because of the opening of the Soviet archives. So they have a secret clause in the treaty that carves up the Polish state, and the Germans and Poles, or the Germans and the Soviets, cooperate to conquer Poland. What comes out of this are some atrocities on the Russian side, where they execute 20,000 Polish officers in the Kentian Forest, and they blame the Germans. So it's a classic example if you want to look at Timothy Snyder's Bloodlands, and the thesis being, you're caught between two totalitarian powers, you're basically screwed. This is true of all of Eastern Europe during this time. Now, 1939 passes. Basically, there's the Sitzkrieg now going on in the West, where Germany is sitting across from the Western Allies and doing nothing. Stalin is hedging his bets that the Western powers in Germany are going to fight a long, protracted war, and will allow the Soviets 1 or 2 more years to continue building their military. Basically, by this time, you're seeing tens of thousands of Russian tanks being produced. You're seeing tens of thousands of Russian planes being produced. Millions of men in the field, like several million. Okay, so it's the largest military in Europe by far. You then have the Soviets swallow up the Baltic states, which had only existed, basically from the end of the First World War till now. And they swallow them up. They demand basing rights, and they just swallow the countries whole. So that happens. There's some disputes with Germany over territory in Romania because they want Bessarabia. They want better positioning vis-a-vis the Axis. There are talks to get the Soviets to join the Axis. Famously, Molotov visits Berlin, and Berlin was being bombed by the Brits at the time, so he's skeptical about the ability of the Germans to weather this war. There are actual plans prior to Case Yellow being launched by the Germans, so Case Yellow being the Manstein sickle cut strategy to develop the British expeditionary force and the French army in the Low Countries. So that's prior to that being launched. There was a French plan on the table to launch bombers from Syria to bomb the Soviet oil fields around Gorky. This was a real plan. This would have involved going to war with the Soviet Union. That almost happened. Was basically averted by the Germans launching their offensive. It was tabled at that point. Now, before I skip over it, there was a Russian invasion of Finland. It's a meme now. We all know how bad that went. The Soviet supply chain was so poor that the Russian soldiers were starving and had no fuel. There's a famous story about the Russians coming upon Finnish multi and smelling the food and dropping their rifles and running and eating, and then the Finns ambushing them and killing them. There's not a lot of progress against the Mannerline line proper, because it's so well done by the Finns, and the Russians are outclassed. The Russian military ends up looking so incompetent that the Germans think this is going to be a walkover, and in fact, this is when Hitler begins to insist on attacking the Russians in a very serious manner. Obviously, the first clash between the Western Allies and the Germans happens in Norway, and this really causes the German surface fleet to be destroyed in terms of combat effectiveness. They lose all their destroyers, so the background of the German fleet is destroyed. But they are successfully able to use a combined arms strategy to overwhelm Norway, kick the French and the British out. Pretty impressive, and this is before they launched their offensive against the Western Allies proper. And this hamstrings their effort to attack the British. Obviously, we know what happens in 1940. The Germans completely conquer in 6 weeks the French. They envelop the BEF. BEF is able to escape due to either deliberate policy by Hitler or Goering's incompetence, whatever you want to believe. And but the heavy equipment of the Brits is not taken with them. Meanwhile, strategically, you see the Italians bungling in other places. They bungle in Yugoslavia. The Germans have to delay Barbarossa's launch in 1941 by a few months in order to meet that. Basically, in the North African theater at the same time, you see an invasion by the Italians, which is basically incompetent. He gets across the Egyptian border, and they just sit there. And the British launch Operation Crusader with, armored formations they shipped from Britain and break the back of the Italian army. And then you have the first of the German formation sent to Africa to deal with this. So you do have dissipation of German strategic power at this point. So you have the Battle of Britain, which results in 2,000 or 3,000 aircraft lost from the German side. These are their strategic bombers. Insofar as they have it, they have medium bombers. Fighters' forces shredded. You have already a diversion of air assets to the home front to defend against the British bombing campaign. British bombers were somewhat ineffective in that they did not have high caliber enough machine guns in the right places like the Americans did. So it hamstrings their effort to defend themselves. And you have obviously the North African Campaign, where they are having to divert assets there to fight the British. So there were multiple plans drawn up, and there were arguments at the strategic level about what could be achieved by the campaign. All right, so you have the generals arguing that they need to take Moscow. And you have Hitler arguing that Moscow is irrelevant, that they need to seize the Ukraine and the oil fields in the Caucasus to economically cripple the Soviet Union and provide them with the oil they're going to need to fight the war. And of those two options, I think that Hitler was actually correct, that they probably should have gone south. But what ends up happening is there's one argument to go north. All right, so there's one argument that they want to go and they want to take Leningrad and then maybe from there take Moscow. There's another argument that they want to go north and go south, leave the center open and maybe take Moscow later. And there's the plan they eventually come upon, which is a three-pronged strategy where they divide their forces into, three different axes and they attack Leningrad, Rostov-on-the-Don, and Moscow respectively. With Army Group North under von Lieb, Army Group Center under von Bock, Army Group South under von Rundstedt. Okay, and then they have another attack up in Murmansk, which is very minor, and they have the help of the Finns to attack in towards Leningrad. Going into the war, they build up 3.5 million men on the Soviet frontier. The Soviets have 6 million men in their military entirely, maybe 2 or 3 million opposing this force. The Soviets have 20,000 tanks, but they're quite poor in quality. There's only a few hundred T-34s and KVs. Soviet infantry is pretty vast. They do have a lot of firepower in terms of automatic weapons, but they're occupying positions that are forward of their Stalin line. The Stalin line was in Russia proper, what we would think of as Russia proper, whereas they're now deployed in the Baltic states and Belarusia, kind of as a forward deployment. Now, it could be argued that Stalin wanted to attack the Germans. He did want to attack the Germans. It might have been in 33, 34. I'm not sorry, not 33, 44. 43, 44 would have been the time frame, probably, just judging by the Soviet buildup. So Hitler's idea was that he couldn't defeat the British, so he wanted to defeat the Russians and just take out their biggest possible ally because he knew that they were going to eventually want to get together. Of course, we know that's ill-conceived. Didn't work out for him. So basically, this is, of course, not unnoticed by the Russians. They do notice that all these formations are here, but Stalin is convinced that this is just a build-up to gain diplomatic concessions. This, of course, is not without precedent. It did happen. Soviet-German cooperation went to the extent that the Comintern was actually ordered to not resist the fascists. Like, that actually happened. So, and there's been evidence that they shipped Jews from Poland back into Germany. So that's something that always happened on a small scale by the NKVD. NKVD and the SS were cooperating on some levels. But anyway, eventually the offensive begins. All right, it's a complete surprise. It ends. Basically, what happens here is that the Russian Air Force of 10,000 planes was basically destroyed on the ground. They didn't even get to take off and fight. The Soviets were completely surprised. This is Blitzkrieg on steroids. You can see from looking at the map, you've got large pockets of Soviet troops outlined in blue. Those are known as Kessels. So the Germans again use Schwerpunkt. They find a place to puncture the line. They envelop it. They create a Kessel. The armor keeps attacking. The Kessels are dealt with by infantry formations that are just, basically on foot. German army was not completely mechanized. Now, one of the supply officers, the head supply officer for the Wehrmacht, was actually quoted as having saying that they won't get farther than Smolensk because that's as far as the horses could go. There was something like 500,000 horses involved in the campaign, so we're not talking about a mechanized army like the American army. Had they had a mechanized army like the American army, that maybe it would have been different. In fact, it probably would have. But the advance towards Leningrad is basically painless for them. They're able to just roll up there. They get to Leningrad and it's pretty tough fighting. Now, you have several encirclement battles on the Central Front. Southern Front goes okay until they realize that around Kiev there is this rather large Russian formation, which is essentially there to block them from gaining the agricultural resources of Ukraine and moving to the Caucasus, because the Russians thought exactly like Hitler. They thought, well, our economic resources are here. We've got the Don Bin with all of its mineral resources. We've got the Ukraine with its grain, and we've got the Caucasus with its oil. This is where the Germans are going to attack. If they take it, they can starve us. So up until the campaign goes okay in the south, but it's not as fast as the Central Front. The Central Front is able to get all the way. Basically, they take Minsk in a massive encirclement. They take Smolensk. They're forced to pause because there's a strategic disagreement at this point. This is where the map comes to an end. Basically, they're at the gates of Leningrad. They have a disagreement with the Finns, and the Finns do not want to advance into the city or closer to the city. They just want to take what they lost to the Russians, the Karelian Peninsula. Smart move on Mannerheim's part, because later on he's able to kind of get himself extricated from his pseudo-alliance with the Axis and not pay the price. The Central Front is able to massively destroy large amounts of Russian forces, but they have to stop. And then Hitler says, well, we have to take Kiev. Kiev ends up being one of the largest encirclement battles in history. That's in September 1941. And after that battle, they do resume their advance in the north. Operation Typhoon proper begins in the middle of the Rasputina, which is the Russian mud season. So they're immediately hampered in their ability to do so. But it does result hundreds of thousands of prisoners, millions of dead on the Soviet part, hundreds of thousands of casualties on the German end. Their armored force is basically crippled. It's kind of likened to a broken sword at this point. And when they begin the offensive again, they've lost so much time in doing these other ancillary objectives that they've kind of lost the plot. And what happens in the meantime, strategically, is the British, of course, immediately ally with the Soviets. The Americans immediately extend them Lend-Lease. This is in contrast to, Harry Truman at the time said this is like the greatest thing ever. We should let the fascists and communists kill each other. That was an opinion. And you have Lend-Lease extended to the Soviets, which enables them to weather a lot of the disasters of the war, whether the Soviets admit it or not. So, they did end up losing the entirety of the Ukraine to the Germans, and that meant the grain resources of Ukraine were immediately going to pass away from them. What prevented them from starving was American food aid. The greatest aphorism you're going to hear about the Second World War, if you want to actually encapsulate it, is it was British brains, Russian brawn, and American technology that won the war. And that's true. So, of course, the Russian formations are very poorly commanded. They're given stay-in-place orders. They fight to the death. They're ferocious soldiers. They do not fight like they do in the First World War, which shocks the Germans. The Germans think they're going to be pushovers. The Russians literally fight to the last man. One of the things that ends up happening because of these Kessel tactics is large numbers of Russian soldiers are able to break away. They form partisan brigades, and they resist the Germans via them. So you have large partisan campaigns that are happening in the rear of the Germans, hampering the supply problem even further. However, you have massive war crimes taking place at the same time. This is not a gentleman's war like it might have been in the West. Okay, you immediately upon the activation of the war have Einstadt's commandos go into the conquered territories and they begin systematic extermination of Jews. Okay, and suppression of local populations. They don't get independence at this point. They're getting suppressed by a second power on top of Stalin, and they initially came out and welcomed the Germans as liberators. So it's quite a misstep not to do that. Later on, you would see Ukrainian formations form SS divisions, things like this. But it is a misstep by the Germans that they don't give them more autonomy and they just take their resources and treat them as bad as Stalin did. The strategic goal of the campaign is to get all the way to Arkhangelsk and then Astrakhan in the south. Of course, that's completely unattainable. It would have meant conquest of European Russia all the way up to the Urals, basically. And they leave a rump state in the east, in Siberia. Of course, strategically, Japan has a non-aggression pact with Russia. They honor it. They don't want to attack the Russians in the rear. There's a little bit of a go north versus go south strategy debate going on in Japan. Had they gone north instead of south, they would have avoided conflict with the United States. But they had no way to access oil resources, so they only had 6 months to go, really. So that's why they attacked the United States. In that case, it was because of the sanctions we leveled on them, gave them pretty much put them in a box. And we gave them an easy target by moving the fleet to Pearl Harbor. That's a whole other can of worms. So that frees up Russia's strategic resources in that theater. And eventually Zhukov is called to Moscow around this time to begin organizing defenses. He had, of course, just defeated the Japanese at Nomahan and Konkan Gol, pretty badly mauling them. Comparable losses of material, but the Russians completely outclassed the Japanese in maneuver warfare, using deep battle doctrine, of course. Japanese had no comparable doctrine for use on all forces, which is unusual because you usually see, you had competing ideas at the time, whether it be Basil Little Hart in England, there were Italian armored warfare doctrines, and de Gaulle in France arguing for the use of tanks. And the Soviets had pretty well developed deep battle doctrine, which you later see come to fruition in 1944-45, in which they're actually operationally defeating the Germans pretty well. A lot of myths about the campaign. There was actual German material superiority in certain areas, so artillery superiority. They actually had parity with them in terms of numbers. The Russians did not outnumber them. You have to be very careful when comparing Soviet divisions to German divisions. Soviet divisions were, at the time, about half the size of German divisions. They were in the midst of reorganizing their table of organization in terms of how they built their divisions, particularly their guards and shock divisions. And that was basically what they were in the middle of doing right when the Germans hit them. Of course, Soviet intelligence was quite good. There were enough communist sympathizers in Germany for them to have quite good intelligence of what the Germans were doing. And so the campaign goes really well. The Germans are reasonably well. The Germans are of course, on the whole, if you look at numbers of divisions, they're completely outnumbered. And maybe not on that front, but if you look at the Soviet capacity to raise new divisions, it's astronomical compared to the Germans. The industrial capacity of Russia is at least on par at this point with the Germans, but it will exceed the Germans over time. So, you have a limited capacity of the Germans to carry on their strategic objectives, which are far in excess of their ability to achieve them. And so that's Operation Barbarossa. It didn't get to where it needed to go. Obviously, after this, they prepare for the final offensive on Moscow, Operation Typhoon, which does not end well for them either. They begin that offensive with pretty understrength divisions. They probably suffered hundreds of thousands of casualties at this point. So they've been significantly blooded. The Soviets, had they been any other kind of state, would have collapsed at this point because they basically lost the army two times over in the West, in the Western military districts. And especially after the Battle of Kiev, that's completely just asinine. That's completely crazy that they were able to take those kind of losses and keep going. Stalin resorts to just killing his generals if they don't do well. You have planes flying in that have NKVD that squads on them that just kill the general and replace him. A lot of Soviet generals just commit suicide. They know what's coming. They don't wait for it. But that's Operation Barbarossa in a nutshell. Of course, you'll see this referred to as a war of annihilation. It really is. Soviet prisoners are completely mistreated and butchered, starved to death, put into death camps, really, forcibly drafted into German rearguard formations to serve supply troops and things like that, which is why at the end of the war you have Russian divisions trying to get to the west to surrender to Americans because they know they're going to surrender to the Russians and get shot. So, it's quite disastrous. It's the majority of the casualties, at least 85%, are inflicted by the Russians. The Russians end up losing like 20 million people all told, and that's just the beginning of the war here. So the Onstadt's commando end up killing 1 or 2 million people by 1942. They find it to be not an effective method of genocide, which leads Himmler to start investigating methods like gas. So it's the genesis of the Holocaust here. Most of their camps are going to be in Eastern Europe, where they're going to be less visible. So quite dark period of human history. It's not often talked about in the United States to the extent that it should be, because we like to focus on D-Day, and we like to think that we single-handedly won the war. It's not the case. That's just my overview off the top of my head of Operation Barbarossa.